Dr. Jeffrey Halstead has been Canandaigua's hometown dentist for more than 35 years, offering routine dental care as well as cosmetic dentistry, implants, and dentures by their highly trained and experienced staff. Visit them online at canandaiguadentistry.com or find them on Facebook and Instagram.
All right, welcome back to the Debrief podcast here on FingerLakes1.com. Josh Durso and Jackie Augustine here inside the FingerLakes1.com studio. It's been a while. The weather was a lot warmer the last time we got together.
It was.
And now it's cold, and
It's going to be warmer this week.
elections are coming. Maybe we get a little more warmth here before the snow starts to fly. But a lot has happened since the last time we talked. A lot.
Yes, a lot is happening.
So before we get into our topics, I wanted to talk about this little endeavor that I took on last month that involved cataloging, I guess, all of the governing agencies and governing bodies across our coverage area, which is like I'll call it like 5.5 counties, right in the middle of the Finger Lakes. All of their town, county, village, and city governing bodies meeting schedule, along with cataloging agendas. So the place where agendas and minutes are posted so that people can engage with their local government,
Which
right?
they should want to do, yes.
Totally. So I spent about a week and a half putting this thing together, and it was complex because not all municipal websites are created equal. That's realization number one. Realization number two was that there aren't very many government bodies updating anything. Like, forget legal principle and legal requirement. So when I created this spreadsheet, I created a second version of it that was sorted based on the week the governing body meets. So first week, second week, third week, fourth week, so that I could kind of see them throughout the month and see when updates were happening, because I figured there had to be some kind of pattern. The only pattern was that a lot of municipalities, big and small, aren't bothering to post meeting minutes months after meetings have happened. Some communities are simply not updating anything in the slightest. And after going through, so give everybody a little frame of reference here, there are like between 90 and 95 municipalities in this spreadsheet, and less than 20 updated their websites, their agenda and or minutes portals in the month of September.
Which doesn't mean they're not meeting.
They're totally meeting. And this is kind of, separate of, and I wanted to talk about this, I just wanted to mention this off the top because, like, there are strands of this problem in every single topic we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
But, when people say, well, nobody shows up to the meeting. Well, nobody engages with us, so we don't. How many times I've heard that from elected officials across the entire region. Why would they? If you're not giving them any reason to show up, other than just whatever happens to strike them in their own personal life, why should they have no reason to show up? If you're not providing them agendas, if you're not posting, because that's the thing is, like, even the best municipalities are posting agendas like 24 to 36 hours before
Right.
the meeting happens.
Yeah, I mean, how could people attend, right? Because a lot of people rely on the posting of the meeting to know, oh, yeah, they're actually meeting, and here's where and when.
Well, we meet at the same time every month. And I understand that, but also, a lot of communities or a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of boards are just posting these very generic, bare bones agendas every month where the only thing listed are just the reports that they're getting from the municipalities, like professionals.
Right,
So,
right.
public work, that sort of thing. That's not enough. It's not good enough. It's really all I'm going to say about that now. But, like, whether it's you know, every municipality seems to have its own rules for how it goes about whose responsibility is. Some have it fall on the clerk, some supervisor, deputy supervisor, whatever the case may be. No matter whose responsibility is, got to do better.
Yeah.
Just got to do better.
That might end up being the theme of today, that you're just not doing it well enough.
Yeah, so and before we get into Geneva, because we'll
You knew
start
what I was
with,
talking about.
We'll
Yep.
start with Geneva. I just want to say that having that be that's my context.
Yeah, yeah.
Geneva's doing very well by comparison to
Yes,
a
let's
lion's
not bash
share
the
of,
staff. The staff
you know,
are doing a
like-
great job, including the clerk, yes.
and you know, Mayor Valentino in Geneva has been readily available to me
Yep, yeah, I
and
saw him
Finger
on
Lakes
here.
One, so kudos to that and thankful for that. Not really, this is actually, that particular issue, I'm far more critical of the very small municipalities who I think in the coming years are going to have to justify their existence to New York State and surrounding communities. If you're not being proactive now,
Right.
ooh, future is going to be tough. The future is going to be tough. So I'm actually going to approach the Geneva topics as a bit of a outside. I'm going to look at this as a complete outsider and ask you questions, and hopefully you can guide us through what is happening there from your perspective. And I guess I'll jump in here and there, but
Okay.
I don't have too many big opinions about Geneva
Okay,
right now.
all right.
Let's start with the budget. We're seeing quite a bit of debate, I guess, among council at different times. How was the feedback from the public? And where do you see this process as it stands right now? We're still like, what, a month and a half away from like a final budget?
I'm pretty sure they will pass it by the end of this month, so I
Okay.
think we probably have 2 work sessions left before they start really, I mean, they're already offering motions now, but I think they're pretty close to passage.
Okay.
I mean, the public comment, I think, was as you would expect, an expression of concern about the city's spending. And, you know, I think it's worth pointing out because unfortunately, the conversation that we're seeing at city council is so muddied. It's very hard, I think, for people who don't know municipal finance to follow what's going on because council doesn't know municipal finance, and thankfully the staff have been basically running a clinic for everybody, counselors and community combined. But I don't think you should have to spend 4 hours watching YouTube videos as a member of the public just to kind of figure out what's going on. Like, you would expect your elected officials to be able to give you an accurate and more concise summary of where they're at. So my attempt at that is that assessments went way up, right? We all know that.
Sure.
And as a result, the actual taxable assessed value of the city went much higher, which gives the city under the existing tax rate a ton more money.
Sure.
So obviously, that's an opportunity to cut back the tax rate and give people not necessarily tax relief, because some bills will go down, but most people's will stay the same or go up a little bit. But it's a really great time to like structurally ask yourself how you can tighten the belt and make sure you don't end up leading the region in taxes again. Unfortunately, because city council is not great at making difficult decisions, their spending over the past 3 years is up $5 million. And right, the standard response they give is, costs go up, it's inflation, what do you expect? Everything goes up, of course. I mean, that's been kind of their mantra. But the fact of the matter is the city manager has done a really excellent job, and the comptroller, and now we've got Adam Blauer's back as comptroller, at least for an interim. Again, no matter who's in the seats, everybody's been saying the same thing, which is we have structural issues in Geneva that need to be addressed. And the more this council has been kicking the can down the line the past 2 years, and it's funny because they keep talking about the former council, but it's similar guys. You know, they've had the majority for a long time. They can't get it under control because they want to please everybody who they consider to be their voters. They're happy making some of us upset, but the people that they think are voting for them, they want to please by not doing anything to cut any of the main cost drivers. And then they're like, oh, don't worry, we're kind of in the middle now in terms of taxes. Well, we're in the middle of the highest range. We're not competitive in terms of tax rate yet, and we won't be unless they do their jobs.
So for folks outside the city, or I suppose folks in the city who haven't watched those hours and hours of YouTube videos, where are the opportunities that you see to potentially cut spending down or to make the budget more efficient?
Well, I don't see that there's anything they'll be able to do before it passes this year, frankly. And I hate to be, I'm usually an eternal optimist, but from what I've seen with this council, they do not have the knowledge, they don't have the curiosity, and they certainly don't have the political will to actually tackle anything structural in the next 2 weeks. If they've avoided it through all of the sessions that the city manager held up to this point, they're not going to do it at the last minute. They're not going to push through, meaningful consolidation of certain services. They're not going to have tough conversations about contract negotiations or any of this. They're not going to do it in the next 2 weeks. So the opportunity, I think, is actually for the public who's now definitely paying attention. You can't go into Wegmans or any like downtown business without people telling you how frustrated they are with this council. I think now there's actually an opportunity for them to realize that if they care about being popular, there's a lot of work to be done to reverse the trend they've started.
So two things stand out to me, hearing that and then also just sort of thinking broadly, not just about Geneva, but other municipalities in general, especially ones with very competent professional staff. Often I will see town, village, county, cities, elected governing bodies rely perhaps a little too heavily on the professionals to make the hard decisions for them.
Yes.
Rather than being the ones who set the policy and then instruct the professionals to do the business, right? And I think that's sort of on one hand, it's great. If you're a municipality that has really strong, competent professionals, that's great. But on the other hand, I think it can long-term create this scenario where, well, I don't really need to worry about that because they're going to, our comptroller is going to make sure that this is all set, or our city manager or our county manager is going to make sure that this is all set. And it's almost like they lose a little bit of ownership of it.
Yes,
absolutely. Again, not exclusively a Geneva thing. I can think of like a half dozen different communities across the whole region that fit this bill. And the other thing is, I really wonder, and we've talked about this theme so many times over the years, is like, how much can we expect out of people who, A, have other jobs, or B, truly treat it as like a part-time job? Like, the problems that municipalities in upstate New York in particular face are so daunting and so big that at minimum it requires more than a 10 to 20 hour effort, right, per week. If we're thinking about it in terms of jobs, like if you're like, you have a side job, side hustle, a second job, something like that, you're maybe putting in 10 or 15 or 20 hours in it at the absolute most. Most of the problems communities across the region are facing require a lot more than that. I think.
I don't know, though, because here's the thing. First of all, if you talk to some of the guys currently on city council, they'll tell you they're working really hard. So I think that makes it worse. But let's just assume, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they're really just too busy to give this their attention, right? That the reason that things are so bad is because they're just busy guys and they just don't have the time. Even if you were treating city council as your quote unquote side hustle, if you actually have the energy and interest and desire to help the community out and fix things, the resources that are available even to give you a thumbnail sketch of what's going on in economic development around the country, what's going on in municipal planning, what is municipal finance? Could we just start with defining what's the difference between the tax rate and the tax levy? Municipal Finance 101. These things are readily available. We're in the age of the internet. I mean, they have at their fingertips reliable information. I don't want to get into the whole thing. We've heard a whole, I mean, they're also sometimes very good at citing totally off the wall stuff. But I mean, the state comptroller puts out white papers. If you can read a page in an hour, you could be well prepared for a city council budget discussion. If you could listen to a podcast, not necessarily ours, but there are municipal economic development and planning podcasts. If you think that sounds boring, you shouldn't be on city council. But if you want the community to be better, on your commute, you could listen to some of this and actually hear what's working and start to learn about some of the things that your gut might be telling you are the right thing are actually proven not to be the right strategies for getting a community that is financially strapped onto more solid footing. I mean, the city manager, Geneva is so fortunate that we have in City Hall right now an exceptionally competent staff. So to your point, I understand why they keep saying, hey, just tell the city manager, cut $2 million, solve our problems. Not her job, but thankfully, if you look at her work outside of the city, I mean, she is keyed in to the City Managers Association, to the Emerging Government Leaders Group. Like, these are groups that are actually working these issues 24/7. And that's why I'm saying the stuff she brought to them to the table ahead of the budget, if they would just think about it, we wouldn't be in the position we're in now. So I'm hoping this is a wake-up call that in the coming year, they'll take their jobs a little more seriously.
I'm not disagreeing. I would just say that, like, I've seen this in quite literally every single community I've ever covered in my career. Elected officials who just give maybe 20% of the 100% that they should. And it's not.
But I'm not saying it, but the point is, it's not impossible. It's not that we need full-time elected officials, because if you have the same personalities just getting paid more to spend more time, you can't create the desire or motivation for someone to do their job well. They either want to do it or they don't. And if they do, what I'm saying is they could find a way in their part-time role to make a difference.
Agreed. And I would say that just sort of adding on to that incentive for municipalities and elected officials alike to want to go above and beyond the threshold is, do you want your municipality to exist as it does in 20 years, 15 years, 10 years? Because the reality is that we're, at bare minimum, barreling toward mass consolidation of services. Mm-hmm. Whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about basic municipal services, or anything in between. Pretty much everything that you interact with at your town level, your city level, your village level, county level, is probably going to see some significant form of consolidation over the next decade or decade and a half. And that, I think, is the reason for municipalities to want to go, elected officials to want to go above and beyond, because it's, again, justification for why you exist in the big picture when harder decisions have to be made down the road. Because this hold the line, we just want to hold the line energy that I see so many elected officials across the region give is like the opposite of what you need to be doing at a time when the deck is already stacked against you. Yep. So that's kind of it. And we're going to talk about bits and pieces of economic development here, but the comprehensive plan in Geneva has been another sort of topic. Despite the budget challenges, there's going to be some money earmarked next year to reinvigorate, I suppose, the comprehensive plan. From the outside, I'll say my biggest skepticism of it is that, having seen communities do this before, not much changes and you spend the money and the plan, like the bones of the plan are roughly the same.
Right.
And if you aren't changing the like month to month behavior of how you're acting on the plan,
Yes, yes.
there isn't going to be much that actually changes. But what are your thoughts on Geneva going back to the drawing board? It's been like, are we out close to like 8 years?
Yes, but I will say this, right? There's been a lot of talk about the comp plan being outdated. I just don't know how people who've read it think that, because the whole point is that it's not a typical comprehensive plan, which most communities now are moving away from that typical comprehensive plan that just says, well, first you do this and then you do that. But our comprehensive plan is a decision-making document which is premised on the idea that Geneva has particular goals, fiscal goals, social goals, structural goals, infrastructure goals, market goals. If those have changed, I think that would be news to a lot of the community. If we no longer want to be a prosperous, beautiful, sustainable, now I'm forgetting the other ones, if those have changed, sure, let's update the plan. Maybe we want to be a suburban, disinteresting, dollar store mecca. I don't know. If that's the case, sure, update the comp plan, because what we have won't get us there. But I think the two things you just said are kind of linked together, right? Municipalities in trouble are going to be forced to consolidate in the future. We don't know what that time frame is, but at some point, like you said, their justification for being, right? They're facing this existential crisis. Somebody is going to solve that for them.
Yep.
If I were cynical, I might wonder if these guys are trying to speed up the process of breaking stuff so that someone will come in and fix it. They don't know how to fix it, so maybe they break it and let somebody else do it. I don't think that's what's going on. I like to be optimistic. I like to be optimistic that they just don't know how to fix the things they're faced with. So a comprehensive plan, things that are talked about in Geneva's plan about downtown revitalization, the Castle Street corridor, I mean, these are things that are currently on the plate. The old Medallas burned down, like redevelopment of that site needs to be top of mind. The downtown business climate and the ability to support small businesses and reactivate the upper floors of those businesses, those are top of mind. I don't see what's in the comp plan that isn't still relevant. I see lots that hasn't been worked. Right? A plan is only as good as what you do with it. And unfortunately, this council has not read it. They're not implementing it. They're not acting on it. So you can keep updating or doing whatever you want, but until the political will changes to actually do something, I just don't know. Like you said, we're going to end up with a plan that says essentially the same things. For a council to what? Continue to ignore? Like, I don't see why you'd spend the $75,000, which is probably why the city manager didn't recommend it, which for all of them saying that they rely on her expertise, when push comes to shove, clearly they don't.
So there's a couple things that stand out there to me, I guess. One is that a theme that we've seen play out where economic development sometimes means waiting for the big thing, the big ship to land. Waiting for the big space shuttle to land in your town, that promises hundreds of jobs, that delivers hundreds of jobs, that whatever the thing is. And the other, you talked a little bit about like this idea of not knowing how to act to turn the ship the right direction. So like, I think there is a genuine, among the people who have the political capital and are engaged in small town politics, I'll call it, I think there is a genuine belief that turning the clock back
Yes.
and going back to the ways of thinking and policy and execution of, I guess, the 80s and 90s and early 2000s is the way to go. I think they genuinely believe it, and that is part of something that I've kind of been like getting more comfortable with saying out loud the last like year or so. Is for the longest time it felt like me looking at it from the outside in every community I had ever covered in my career. I was saying like, how can they possibly believe that going back to the policies of the mid-90s, economic development policies of the mid-90s, will bear any fruit in this current space we're now in for a long, long list of reasons. But truly, I think they believe it. I think
we are seeing-
most elected officials who say it, I think they believe it.
I do think, and that's why we are seeing a slow municipal death by nostalgia. I
Yep.
mean, it is a failure to confront the realities, the financial and social realities of our upstate New York situation. And I don't mean that to say it's bad. There are so many wonderful things that would and do make people choose to live here, to locate here. Unfortunately, those are not the things valued or even recognized by the people making decisions. And as such, they take exactly the wrong actions to undermine it. And then you see what happens. I mean, someone at the city council meeting made a really prescient statement when they said, every time we do something, 4 more houses go on the market. Yes, people are watching and they see when things start heading in the wrong direction, people who have choices will make choices to live elsewhere. And again, that's a lesson of the comp plan, but again, that's on unread page 55.
So that is a perfect segue to the next two things we have to talk about, because a few weeks ago I wrote a newsletter talking about the region's housing crisis, and we talked about the Ontario County's effort during our last episode in June or July, whenever that was, and it really focused on like this reality that communities need to acknowledge the reality that they're facing and stop saying no to everything. Like, you can't just say no to everything. And it was really interesting. I wanted to talk about the feedback from it, because the feedback was, there were like 30 or so emails that came back to me after I wrote it. And every single one of them I could put in 2 buckets. Bucket number 1 was, thank God you said that, which, okay, whatever. Those responses, love them, but also not very productive. They don't really help anything. Or they were, yeah, sure, but, and then led to some long explanation of why they oppose any kind of change whatsoever, or pieces of change, or whatever the case may be. And it gets to something that I've found so interesting, just observing how people interact with local politics, national politics, the whole thing is like main character syndrome on steroids. Everything is related to me. Yeah, but I.
Right.
Yeah, but I. And the yeah, but I, with the thing that follows yeah, but I, is the most niche, like, encounter or experience that is completely out of step and out of tune with reality.
Right.
And it's either that people are so overburdened and overwhelmed by their personal problems that they don't have the capacity anymore to see the bigger picture and see these communities' problems for what they are, or it's just straight up stubbornness. I don't know which. But the hook of that first newsletter that I wrote was essentially that, like, we don't need to look at the housing stock problem as like we just need to add more housing units. We need to rebuild communities.
Right.
And that is so much, that involves so much more than just adding houses.
Right.
Like, it's so much more complex than that. And it's really hard to foster any kind of real conversation about rebuilding community when almost every single person who engages says, yeah, but I. And that's like the start. That's their jumping off point. And I know there's probably some really good psychological and sociological reasons for why people are at that point now. But it was just really interesting to me. That was what stood out to me the most after writing it and listening to the feedback. And I'm going to say this, like a lot of the feedback that the Yeah But I's had, completely fair, good feedback. But when it becomes the centerpiece and you can't allow yourself to think about solutions because you're so wrapped up in your specific issue with whatever solution is being, or even just the problem itself and how the problem's being talked about, it gets really hard to like have a meaningful conversation. I just kind of talked in a circle there, but like that's sort of where I sat afterwards, and I was like, this is the next thing I need to write, is about this. But I think I'll get a lot of yeah but I's if I write that. But it's just interesting to me because that doesn't come up in the conversation as like a roadblock per se, but it's most definitely a roadblock.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
Like, because that's what, and I think about like using your point, talking about how Geneva City Council, for example, interacts. Like, so if a governing body, whether it's a city, a town, a village, if that's the only feedback they're hearing, think about the weird echo chamber of decision making that's created by it.
Right.
Where you have like elected officials who are kind of like defensive and antsy about like doing some really groundbreaking stuff and is just afraid of breaking things for the greater good long term, when the only people who are really engaging with them are the ones who are saying, like, centering self in their argument for or against whatever it is they're talking about. It's hard.
It's very hard.
Am I crazy?
No, you're not crazy. You've definitely put your finger on a huge problem. And I'm glad you wrote that. And I'm glad you got that kind of feedback. And I agree with you. It's always nice to hear like, oh, I agree with you. But you really want to dig in and hear the people who don't agree with you, because that's where, the exciting stuff happens. And not to say that people who are nice are not exciting. That's not what I mean. But, further thinking on the matter, it can be had when people are really pushing back, which is great. But I think what I'm constantly trying to check myself that, everyone knows I love the comp plan, right? I don't mean to be a one-trick pony in that way, but I keep asking myself, okay, am I only seeing things through that lens? Like, do I need to consider other things? And that's why I think making use of other resources is so important, to keep asking, okay, I like the comp plan because of this. Is that still what I'm hearing on these, planning podcasts as relevant indicator? Is this still proving to be the right stuff? Because if it's not, we do need to change it, right? But I think when you have an issue like housing, the person that the city hired to do the economic development study said something so interesting and actually so sad. I left that meeting so demoralized, sadly, because toward the end of his presentation, he said, well, the city needs more housing. Whoever's telling you you don't have a housing problem is not paying attention, or that's a paraphrase. But then he did say directly, this is a pretty near quote because I wrote it down and because it was just kind of stunning. He said, you need to densify. The problem is the people in the neighborhoods don't want it. So you got to find somewhere else to put your housing. And I thought, that is the problem.
Yeah.
That is the problem, because what you want is some cookie cutter box to put somewhere where we can house the people. And everybody made fun of Ken Camera for talking about redeveloping the plaza. Well, that's what the economic developer was talking about, Hamilton Street Plaza.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm sure now someone's going to pick it up and say that's their brilliant new idea, because no one ever wants to credit Ken when he says anything. But, the thing is, we can never have accessory dwelling units then. We can never have additions to houses. We can never redo zoning in a meaningful way. And you saw it. This city it was suggested in the comp plan that they redo their zoning, remove some regulatory barriers, and they couldn't get it to the finish line. They got 70% there, but they took out the innovation. They took out the things that could have unlocked a lot of development in the city. And there was a developer in town the other day looking at the OEO site and said to me, like, I don't know, I watch these meetings. I don't want to work with these guys because the ideas that I might have, not me, the developer, might not fit into the boxes they've constructed. And they seem so willing to stop everything because one person doesn't like it. And that, I think, is the problem that you're saying, that one person says, it's probably a good idea, but I don't want it right here, or but I have this issue with it. And if you have a elected official or many who want to be liked and can't make the tough choices, then it's very hard to convince the development community to take a chance on anything that actually could make things better.
Yeah, so I jotted down a couple of the main questions that came back to me after writing that. How will this impact my property or resale value? Do I want to see a housing development or apartment complex across the road from me? Who will live there?
Yep.
We've all heard those
Those
questions.
are the classic NIMBY questions.
We've all
right?
heard those
Not
questions
in my
before.
backyard.
But and I've never recommended a book so many times in just a couple weeks span in my entire adult life. But William Fulton, originally an Auburn guy, wound up being a mayor out in California, he's also a city planner, has a book called Place and Prosperity. And it essentially documents, so he uses Auburn as his example in that book. But he's written, so he's on Medium, he's on Substack. You can, if you just Google his name, you'll find so many really interesting things that he's written about planning. And it's always struck me interesting because, like, you don't have to put it where it already exists. If you want to build from the ground up, walkable, workable, functioning new neighborhoods. Like everyone always talks about housing like it has to be where the neighborhoods already exist through this density. And I agree, like that is when we're talking about like the path of least resistance, of course. But if communities wanted to really attract future tax revenue, meaning human bodies, to come to live in a place, whether it's a city like Geneva or whether it's a smaller town, whether you're a very rural place or anything in between, you can build from the ground up new, walkable, sustainable communities that check all of those boxes, that have density, that have people who want to live in those. And you can do it without having to impact, but that's a different approach. It's this idea, though, where you're always coming back to, unfortunately, NIMBYism and then just saying, well, that's it.
Right. And what you said, I mean, is talking about neighborhood development. That's different than a developer coming in and building a building. A neighborhood development has to have like a logic and amenities and intentionality in the way that putting a piece of property out to bid and saying, hey, this guy wants to build a box on it, that is not building a neighborhood. So it's like, and I hate to keep coming back to Geneva, but I mean, it's what I don't want to speak about things I don't know about, and I feel like Geneva's, I don't know everything, but that's the area I know something about. And, you know, in Geneva, they're kind of making both errors. They can't innovate in the neighborhoods, and they also can't take the scarce available land that's remaining and create neighborhoods. They're kind of doing the worst of both worlds, which is let's not do anything in the existing neighborhoods because I don't want to rock the boat with the voters. And if I have a piece of land, let's just build something on it and call that progress and not actually think about whether that is a sustainable neighborhood that attracts people. Like they see the building as the success, not the living in it as the success.
Yeah.
And it's just, again, if they would read this book that you suggested, which I'm excited to read now, although I have to, in full disclosure, it's going to go on I got a stack of books that getting through. But again, they can read, you said Medium, Substack, right? If they give it 20 minutes of their time once a week,
Yeah.
they could get clued into strategies that really work and get out of the box they've put themselves in, which is, this is what I know, this is what I think. You can't tell me anything different.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, so this, again, a perfect sort of segue into last topic, which involves burned dairy. So by now, most people, if you live in Seneca County, if you live around Seneca County, you've seen the large burned dairy that's going up on the corner of 5 and 20, 414. The company is closing, or I think by now it's actually closed, its small store in the former village of Seneca Falls. Last month, when that news came out, there was a lot of frustration on social media about it closing, how it should stay open, because people need access to what that store provided, because it was kind of think of it as the last not gas station where you could grab like milk, eggs,
Bread, yeah,
cheese,
yeah.
bread, cereal, like it covered more than just like the nearby gas stations. And it was right, essentially, it's just outside of downtown. Like it's very walkable. So I wrote another newsletter, Policy Decisions Have Consequences, looking at that closure and the debate that happened back 5-6 years ago about whether the town should allow Circle K to build a larger convenience store on the corner of the Bridge and Rumsey Street and Fall Street, where the Huntington building is. Everybody around here remembers that debate and how it unfolded. It was about it's about a quarter mile up the road to give everybody a little perspective. And I'm not here so I was at the time viewed as one of the people critical of the housing option, and I was, basically saying the town should really seriously consider doing allowing some kind of convenience store to open here, because grocery store has been gone from the village for years, and that isn't changing anytime soon. I don't want to relitigate that, because now with hindsight and the things that I'm doing in my personal life, I basically view that as it was this versus that, which was Huntington building versus Circle K. It just boiled down to we can have this or we can have that. And I'm happy that the senior housing option ultimately went through and is now almost complete. I think people will be living in it by early 2025. But I titled that newsletter, Policy Decisions Have Consequences, because boiling that debate down to this versus that really failed the community.
Yes.
In a big way. So 3 things that stand out, and then I want to get your feeling on these types of situations. One, something I've learned being on the Village of Webster's Historic Preservation Commission is that you don't get to say no and walk away, right? You don't get to just say no to something when you hear residents saying, whether it's a big chunk or a small chunk or anything in between, and say, well, we're done now, wash your hands of it, walk away. You have to be part of the solution post outcome. And then the second point is there was lots of talk about how a senior housing project was going to, especially there, was going to unlock this walkable community and transform Seneca Falls and that portion of Fall Street into something, and absolutely nothing's happened since then, because there hasn't been any meaningful progress on executing the things people have vaguely talked about for the last 10 years on that front. And it's just because this housing project is complete in January or February, Are we all of a sudden going to see more people walking up and down the streets of Seneca Falls? When you think about a walkable community, it's more than just bars and stores, right? Like you need housing, but you really need some kind of I think a grocery store or some kind of option on that front. That is really, really important. More important than the restaurants or the bars or anything else like that. And then the third point was last year or the year before, I can't recall the exact date on it, Seneca County commissioned a housing study. And in that study, it essentially validated all of the things people were saying when this debate about Circle K and the Huntington building was unfolding, which is that the community is getting older. The community does not, a larger percentage now than 15, 20, 30 years ago of the population has reliable transportation, and the community is getting significantly poorer. So, and here's the thing, that report came out in 2022 or 2023, but even a casual conversation with anybody from the nonprofit space in Seneca County, the House of Concern, or any of the agencies that are providing relief to the most vulnerable people in Seneca Falls, Waterloo, Seneca County at large, would have bore out enough evidence that maybe we should have a conversation about this beyond, if not here, we need to have a conversation about finding a place for this in a semi-walkable location. I'm not saying Circle K would have been interested in doing that. I'm not saying it would have worked out and it would have absolutely happened. But there wasn't even a vague effort to have. It was, we don't want this here, and that's it. And it kind of just boils down to this attitude of you don't get to lecture the community about what it wants or needs, especially after they told you. The data showed you, and one walk around the community lays it out crystal clear that that NIMBY approach to I just don't want it here is not the way to govern. You have to be engaged after you say no. I think it should be one of those scenarios where if any governing body, whether you're a historic preservation commission, whether you're a planning board, zoning board, you shouldn't be allowed to say no without providing some kind of path forward. Because essentially allowing those entities to just say no and quit and walk away creates this vacuum where they get the desired outcome they're looking for, but long term it creates a lack of planning, a lack of anything. Nothing happens. And now we're left in this scenario where I will say the people who most frequently trafficked the burn dairy, the smaller burn dairy near downtown, were definitely poor. Some of the people who worked in that store did not have transportation and could not transfer to another burn dairy location because they don't have a way to get there. It's not a large enough percentage of customers, right, to justify burn dairy having two locations literally within a mile of each other on the road. It's a 10-minute drive between those two spots. But at the same time, the community needs to be planning, and these governing bodies need to be thinking about these realities that are only going to be exacerbated over the next 10 years. None of those trend lines are going to reverse because there's now a senior housing option on up the road. And that is just a very troubling, it's just a very troubling thing because it feels like the community has lost out so much, not because Circle K wasn't able to get its way and demolish the Huntington building, but because not a single iota of effort has been put into trying to solve for this now gigantic problem. If I'm creating a top 10 list of the things that make a community least sustainable, not having a grocery store is damn near the top. Really, I mean, I'm fully down the rabbit hole.
it's a productive rabbit hole.
Fully down the rabbit hole.
You have given me so much to think about, and wow, let's start with, you are 100% right. Policy decisions have consequences, and I think that goes unnoted by the people who have the power to make policy, and entirely noted and suffered by the people who suffer the consequences of those policy decisions. I'll put in a plug for nonprofits being the canaries in the coal mine all the time. They know what's going on in the community. They know what people want and need. Rarely are they listened to. Usually takes somebody else, like a housing study person, to say, oh, wow, whew, man, you guys are having trouble with housing. Like, right, nonprofit sector could have told you that 10 years ago and predicted these trends. But again, so I think all communities could benefit from leaning on the people who are closest to their ear on the ground, doing the hard work every day. But then, the thing that really jumped out as you were talking is we've gotten ourselves into a problem-based mindset where there is this, it's a zero-sum game. Someone's going to win, someone's going to lose, and we just got to pick who's loudest, who's most well-connected, who do I like more, and I'm throwing my chips toward them, and, the other person can just go whatever. I think we really, and again, this is not, in every case, I try to say in the columns, in anything I say publicly on this podcast, everything, I try to make clear I am not an expert in this. The only things that I'm trying to do are synthesize the research and good work of actual experts out there that could be brought to bear on what's going on in our region, because this region needs champions, it needs good ideas, it needs political will and strength and courage to do difficult things, but it needs solutions. We have to shift to a solutions-based approach where, like you said, if we come in, again, I'm sorry to make everything Geneva-centric, but that's my frame of reference, right? This argument about building on the lakefront, if you ask people, no one wants to just like mess up the lakefront like that. Except, there's a couple people who want their house, but whatever, set them aside. If you're self-interested, you don't get to be part of the conversation. But, people who say, oh my goodness, just build on the lakefront, what they're actually saying is, I would like tax relief. I would like a solution to my burden. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if we take a solutions-based approach, instead of me hammering on the fact that I don't want you building on the lakefront, which personally I don't, yeah, I think there are other solutions, and I want to help find those other solutions so that maybe you'll back off what I think is such a bad idea. But people rarely come to it from that perspective. They don't want to answer the question. They don't want to find progress. They want to find something to hang their hat on. They want to find something that they can say they did or they stopped. And that is such a problematic approach. You can see it brewing. It's what happened, right? What you described in Seneca Falls, I wasn't part of that conversation, but from the way you described it, and I trust your recounting of it, there were people who wanted to save a building, and there were people who wanted to have a development of this convenience or this gas station plus. And the two were just this conflict of wants. Could there have been a solution where we say, we recognize there's a need for housing, restoring this building could help meet that need, but if we're going to be bringing more people in, we can't dismiss the idea that food or access to convenience is something that needs to be supported in a neighborhood environment. So what's our solution to get both things done? And I think, like you said, people are short-sighted. They fight the battle immediately in front of them and totally lose sight on the long-term trajectory of the community that suffers from the short-sighted decisions. I'm not saying Seneca Falls is suffering for a senior housing project. That can still be a net good. But if you've
It was.
lost sight, yes.
It was like
yes.
the housing project's a net positive,
Yes.
100%.
But if you lose sight of the unsolved problem that was motivating some of the opposition, then you've lost an opportunity to make your community even better.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is, I think we, I don't know. I think we have people in charge who have short attention spans, limited knowledge, and not a lot of gumption. And I think until those three things change, we're going to keep getting these zero-sum debates, and the communities are going to suffer for it.
Last point there for me, I will say until I moved to Monroe County and I got involved in the village of Webster a couple of years ago, especially with historic preservation, I was not aware. I was under the impression that historic preservation pretty much only looked like what it did in places like Seneca Falls, which is we need to save this thing with a side dish of NIMBYism and ignore the problem, wash your hands, walk away. I'm not saying nothing against the people who have made decisions for the last 20 years. But I didn't even realize until the last few that really if you're going to do it the right way, you need to be engaged with the problems, not just with the should we do it or should we not do it. And then the last thing in general, it's really interesting listening to people who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s describe how great these communities were across the Finger Lakes back 50, 60, 70 years ago when they had things like neighborhood grocery stores. And then to see absolutely none of that land where a lot of the folks who fit into these age brackets who are now policymakers, they don't want to go all the way back to that. They want to go back to I guess what was the peak of the suburban boom, which I guess would have been like the 80s or 90s. And that's just really problematic because what communities really need is to go back to how they were structured 70 or 80 years ago in terms of physical makeup. I'm not talking about ideology and things like that. I'm just talking about physical makeup of having neighborhood grocery stores, things that people could walk to easily, things that people could get to easily to basically create a microeconomy that can then grow into a larger economy across a broader area. But
Man, it sounds like you read Geneva's comp plan.
I think that's
Don't
the
worry,
basis.
it'll be undone soon.
Hey,
You don't have to worry about those good ideas anymore.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition. If you have any questions, you can drop them in an email to debrief@fingerlakes1.com. If you want to see or hear more, subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or you can follow Finger Lakes One on TikTok. Thanks for listening or watching. We'll see you next time.